Bueno, estimada audiencia, bienvenidos a Simania Lecturas de Salón. I will start in Spanish and then I will switch to English, so don't worry. El Simania Lecturas de Salón es una plataforma que coordina en el marco de las actividades organizadas por la Asociación de Estudios Judeo-Latinoamericanos, conocida como LAJSA, y a la cual les invito a afiliarse. Mi nombre es Cynthia Gabbay y soy investigadora y escritora. Trabajo actualmente en la Universidad Humboldt de Berlín y mi investigación está financiada por la Fundación Alemana para la Investigación Científica. Hoy nos reunimos para conversar junto a Raanan Rein en torno a su monografía Jewish Self-Defense in South America, Facing Anti-Semitism with a Club in Hand, publicada en 2022 en inglés por la editorial Routledge, que tendrá próximamente traducciones al hebreo y el castellano. Nos acompañan en la tarea Adriana Brodsky y Federico Finchelstein. Simania, que en hebreo significa señalador de libros, fue ideado para ofrecer un espacio donde debatir libros publicados en el área de estudios judeo-latinoamericanos o de interés para nuestra disciplina, ya sean recientes o de larga data. Renuevo entonces esta invitación, que ya es tradición, independientemente de si son ustedes los o las autores o bien lectores curiosos, si consideran que, por dar solo algunos ejemplos, es necesario leer juntas la poesía de Rubén Sinaí, los ensayos de León Rosichner o alguna novela de Alicia Dujovne Ortiz, LAJSA ofrece este espacio para dialogar en torno a obras de nuestro interés. Los encuentros de Simania alientan el debate multilingüe tan característico de las culturas judías. Siendo las lenguas oficiales del LAJSA el castellano, el portugués y el inglés, estamos sin embargo abiertos a la posibilidad de integrar en Simania otros idiomas. Hagamos de este espacio un lugar ameno, no solo para el debate, sino también para el intercambio de entusiasmos. Aprovecho también para anunciar nuestro próximo encuentro, que se llevará a cabo el 6 de marzo, en torno al trabajo Keeping the Mystery Alive, Jewish Mysticism in Latin American Cultural Production, de Adriana M. Dichos los prólogos, comenzaré presentando a los participantes de hoy, and without your permission, I will switch to English. Adriana Brodsky is Professor of Latin American and Jewish History at St. Mary's College of Maryland. Her book, Sephardi Jewish Argentine, Creating Community and National Identity between 1880 and 1960, appeared in 2016. She has published on Sephardi food, schools, beauty contests, and Latin American Jewish history in general. She's now finishing a manuscript on Argentine youth in Zionist movements between the 1940s and 1970s. And since 2014, she has been co-president of the Latin American Jewish Studies Association. Federico Finchelstein is professor of history at the New School for Social Research and Eugene Lang College. He's the author of 7 books on fascism, populism, dirty wars, the Holocaust, and Jewish history in Latin America and Europe. His books have been translated into Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Chinese, Hungarian, Korean, and Turkish. Among them, I will only mention the last ones: Fascist Mythologies from 2022, A Brief History of Fascist Lies from 2020, From Fascism to Populism in History from 2017, and The Ideological Origins of the Dirty War, Fascism, Populism, and Dictatorship in the 20th Century Argentina from 2014. And Raanan Rein, author of the book we are presenting today, is the Elias Suratsky Professor of Latin American and Spanish History, the former co-president of LAJSA and former vice president of Tel Aviv University. Raanan Rein is the author and editor of more than 50 books and more than 150 articles and book chapters. Among them are Populism and Ethnicity, Peronism and the Jews of Argentina from 2020, Football, Jews and the Making of Argentina from 2014, Argentina Argentina, Israel y los Judíos from 2007, and In the Shadow of the Holocaust and the Inquisition, Israel's Relations with Francoist Spain from 1997. Raanan Rein is corresponding member in Israel of Argentina's Academia Nacional de la Historia and was decorated by the Argentine government with the title of Commander in the Order of the Libertador San Martin. Regarding our presentation today, Jewish self-defense in South America facing anti-Semitism with a club in hand, researches on the Jewish youth self-defense groups in Argentina and Uruguay in the wake of an anti-Semitic wave in the 1960s. The research is strongly based on oral history, and it was carried out during long years. Quoting the author, I highlight that the main significance of these activities was not so much their contribution to the protection of Jewish communities from the dangers of clashes and pogroms. In fact, many of the interviewees in this research project questioned this aspect of the work they did. It did have, however, an important influence in shaping the Jewish and Zionist identities of these young people, and it also encouraged many of them to emigrate to Israel and settle there. The book also develops a cultural aim to these activities. It points at the reshaping of Jewish masculinity vis-a-vis traditional diasporic gender identities from the one hand, and Zionist or Israeli identity from the other hand. Raanan Rein examines how Israel's activities through the Mossad, diplomacy, emissaries of kibbutz movements, and the Jewish Agency influenced the daily lives of tens of thousands of Jews in Latin America in a particularly stormy period in which the use of violence was legitimized by some Zionist tendencies in order to promote ideals. The book brings also astonishing revelations regarding the eventual ties created during the 1970s dictatorships in Argentina and Uruguay between ex-Irgun members and leftist guerrillas. Most importantly, it questions Israeli secret policies of intervention in the Jewish diaspora and their relation to the local societies of which they were an integral part of. With this last word, I will give place to Adriana Brodsky, please, and then we will continue with Professor Finchelstein, and lastly with Raanan Rein.
Thank you. I'm going to just set my my timer on so that I don't speak more than welcome. First of all, I want to thank again Cynthia for organizing and maintaining this platform for the exchange of ideas and for learning about new work that is coming out. So hats off to you and the work that you do. To Raanan for inviting me to share my thoughts on his work, and for those of you who are joining us from all over the place. It's a pleasure to see some of you again. And Federico, of course, it's good to see you here too. I found the book to be an excellent window into some of the experiences of Jews in the 1960s in Latin America. I very much appreciated the centrality of the voice of participants in these events, even when I heard them talk as adults, rooted in a very different reality than the one the book covers chronologically. And I hope that we can perhaps have a chance to discuss oral history and this duality, right? Sort of talking about events from a very different context. And I think that it is especially important to highlight the use of this methodology, especially for events which, like this one, their very nature makes it impossible to find in written sources. I particularly liked a few images that Raanan uses in this book because, at least to me, they conveyed central tropes and ideas that helped me grasp what this experience was like for those living these years at the time. And these images share this idea of living in between, a living on a border or al borde. And so I'll discuss a few of them, and then I'll offer some thoughts on youth in Argentina prior to the time that Raanan is focusing on in this book. The first one is his, Raanan's decision to talk about this, the Irgun, or, this group or these collective of self-defense activities as being in the semi-clandestinidad, right? Semi-clandestine, whatever. With its combination of James Bond type of activities, the adrenaline rushing, a sense of adventure, which in the context of the Cold War, that made spies and overt operations a modus operandi that inspired and enticed young people. The secrecy, right, that participants talk about, which granted importance to them as participants, and also showed trust. Secrecy also made it possible to, and I use the Spanish word, poner el cuerpo for something good. Would friends and families have allowed them to become involved if these acts, if they had known about them? So maybe, right, but not all. Yes, yet this secrecy was also not so secret, as also Raanan suggests, providing as well, on the one hand, recognition of a job well done, making the sacrifice expected worth it. The notion of semi-clandestinidad brings us to another on-the-border tension that Raanan explores in his book. This question of whether this was top down or bottom up. And that is, a sort of a tension that existed between Israel, this idea of Israel setting up, controlling, organizing, managing, and the agency showed by the young people in acting on their own when the situation made it necessary. Of course, with the possibility that they made mistakes. And, there's a couple of examples that Raanan presents, like these young, Jews sort of going after and beating up somebody who ended up being a Jew himself. The book attempts to show us both sides of this divide. On the one hand, the changing ideas in Israel about the role of this new country in defending Jews elsewhere, previous experiences in North Africa that provided models that could be applied to other situations, the leaders and their desire to organize or rein in that youthful energy, the shlichim, right, the representatives, the training camps in Israel and in Argentina. And on the other hand, we hear young people deciding on their own that their path was to fight. Think about that 14 to 15-year-old who said, and I'm quoting Raanan's quote here, we have to organize a defense. We are not going to just take it anymore. Think also on the decisions made by some individuals like Tata Furumansky, who reminded Raanan that he created a training ground in the 1940s to pursue its own objectives. And in that case, right, Tata ended up not even being recognizing for the work that he had done. But that tension between top down or bottom up, which runs throughout the book, seems to tilt towards the centrality of the agency of the actors he interviews and whose perspectives are central to the book. Raanan, in fact, chooses to start the book with a 1964 event in Córdoba, in which young Jews decide on the spur of the moment and given a violent attack on one of their members to hunt down a fascist thug and beat him up. There seems to be very little organized about this, just a few young men who decided to react to violence by acting. At least for me, that opening sets the tone for how I read the rest of the book. This idea that although it seems to be a duality, right, the centrality of the voices give the reader the idea that, that there was a very important component about the agency and about the fact that the people in Argentina, the young people in Argentina are very active, right, in creating these types of organizations. Another useful image of in-between or al borde is the role that self-defense played in helping young men, and by extension, all the Jewish community, defend their belonging to the nation. And so that duality is between belonging and not belonging. and what this tells us about, I mean, what does self-defense groups and the activities that they participated in and the activities in which they organized contributed to cement the idea of making Aliyah, or whether these activities were meant to make it possible for Jews in Argentina to live as Jews in peace, knowing that they would be guarded and presenting an image of strength rather than one of weakness. And so it is to this point, right, to whether these groups contributed to Aliyah or to life in the diaspora, that I would like to suggest that an important context, that of the role Jewish youth in Argentina played in the minds of Jewish Argentines, starting in the 1940s, can add to this discussion. And so I just wanted to start by suggesting, right, that the role of youth and what youth needed to do in Jewish in Argentina, is something that starts at least, right, in the 1940s. And I identify 1941 in particular because over 4 months, in the early months of 1941, the Buenos Aires Jewish weekly Mundo Israelita surveyed 16 Jewish leaders in order to identify the problems and concerns of Jewish Argentine youth. With each issue, readers encountered the responses of Jews from the city as well as from the countryside, female and male, and Sephardim and Ashkenazim. The 10 questions posed suggested that Mundo Israelita assumed that there were important divisions among the Jewish youth, that they were not involved in community institutions, and that Zionism had an important role to play in mobilizing and solving the problems at hand. The respondents shared the belief that youth were apathetic and disoriented, and with the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, as well as in Argentina, and the anxiety over assimilation that the Jewish community in Argentina felt, they all agreed that it was imperative that youth mobilized and acted. And what they defined, right, as being at stake was not just the young generation, but the future in general of all Jewish people. And this is a quote that they provided in one of these, responses: "If the youth don't save our people, no one will. Si a nuestro pueblo no lo salva la juventud, no lo salva nadie." So the 1941 Mundo Israelita survey had 2 very important interrelated objectives. The respondents demanded that youth imagine themselves transnationally as Jews like other Jews around the world, diasporically in conversation with the idea of a Jewish center, and importantly, nationally, as part of a collective that encountered specific problems in Argentina, by suggesting that they had an important role to play in addressing this Jewish question. And importantly, I think that this grounds the issue of what Jews need to do in Argentina, and ground the role that Zionism could play in, right, helping the Jewish Argentine community to exist. So I suggest, right, that some of these ideas about the role of youth, which of course Raanan picks up in the 60s in a different context, have this history in the Jewish in the history of the Jewish community in Argentina, in the context of grounding and keeping, right, Jews in Argentina in a way that is safe, in a way that is not diluted, in a way that is not passive, but rather, right, turning these youth, these young people into active, into actively addressing the challenges of the time. And so it is interesting that overall in the 1941 survey, one of the conclusions that were reached was that that youth in Argentina at that time were unwilling to fight. Now, of course, they propose all sorts of solutions, and that fight in the 1940s was not necessarily fighting, grabbing a club, and going after the fascist thugs who beat up Argentine Jews. But rather at that time, right, the fight was envisioned as participating actively in Jewish institutions. There was a call for, for creating institutions that would welcome, these young members. It was certainly, the idea that the bodies of these young people needed to be trained, that would, right, bring in this notion of dignity, which the respondents of this survey suggested was one of the things that were lacking. And I think that here I pick up some of the ideas that Raanan sort of continues to discuss, right, in his book, the notion, the connection to dignity, right, and this idea of presenting a different image, right, from the Jew that was weak, from the Jew that was not able, right, to sustain, the attacks, and just only being able to passively, right, take the blows. And so in a sense, right, and I think that Raanan talks about the creation of Maccabi and the connection between Maccabi, Maccabilandia, and these spaces as in the 1960s providing the grounds on which these youth groups would physically train for responding to the 1960s context, which required perhaps a sort of a physical and violent response that already existed in the 1940s. And so the fact that, it is very clear that in the creation of Maccabi, it is not necessarily the objective of creating Jews, which was part of the problem, because, the respondents are suggesting in the 1940s that these young people are just assimilating to Argentine society without remaining Jewish enough. And so part of what Maccabi stands for is this idea of turning these Argentines into proud Jews, which involved, of course, right, the use of the gym, the change of their bodies, and Raanan does a good job of providing a little bit of that context. But it is also important to remember that in the 1940s, whenever there was a chance of looking back and celebrating the creation of Maccabi in the 1930s, part of what they say in the 1940s is that the institution is also training Argentines as well. And so that these institutions, at least in the 1940s, are not necessarily only linking, right, these young Argentine Jews to, right, Jews elsewhere or, to Israel, later on when Israel exists, but grounding this generation in the Argentine context. And so we read things, for example, in which they talk about Maccabi, the club, right, as inspiring, and I quote here, right, using American figures like San Martin and Artigas, Washington and O'Higgins, Bolivar and Tiradentes, liberators of people who dreamed about and fought for other people's freedoms. So I think that that thinking in a sense about this larger context of the role of youth in fighting, right, and sort of thinking about what fighting meant in the different contexts of the decades as we move forward, can help us understand this long trajectory, right, of this idea, and perhaps, right, it kind of it could help to add, this context to the question, right, that Raanan seems to be unequivocally leading, right, to the response that these events or participation in self-defense was one of the consequences of this participation was only, right, was one, right, the idea of connecting these young people with Israel to the point of, right, sort of espousing or promoting Aliyah. I think that the context here of these longer contexts also reminds us, right, of this standing in between, right, in between creating and grounding and making people feel safe in Argentina, which has, as I mentioned, right, this kind of decades-long existence as a project for the Argentine Jewish community, with the specificity, right, of the 1960s, which required that Jews responded to the attacks by these thugs, which were with clubs in hand, also with clubs in hand. And so I'm just adding this context, as a way to perhaps understanding the decades-long discussion that was part of not an assimilationist, project per se, but thinking, right, that these were ways in which the Jewish Argentine community was going to be able to face a future that had a future. So I'm going to stop here with these comments, and I'm going to let Federico go on. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, it is for me also a great pleasure to talk about Raanan's new book. As always, I mean, if I have to perhaps be a little bit, or to engage a little bit in a dichotomy, there are those historians that complement by adding or rethinking, the work of others, and there are historians that do really create knowledge, and that is Raanan's case. I mean, just to start, I mean, this is something that I kept telling myself when I was reading. Is that, oh wow, I didn't know this. And by this I mean not only gems of knowledge that by recuperating the memories of all those people that are interviewing this book, but rather also by creating historical knowledge, that is to say, to give meaning and to explain those memories in a larger context. That is what Raanan does in this book, and that's what I meant actually when I say I didn't know that. It's not a particular fact, but how that fact, which is a gem in itself, leads to a larger explanation, which allows us to explain different histories and different contexts. And in a way, I mean, because I have read, probably many of you, if not all, perhaps, I wouldn't claim all, but a lot of Raanan's previous books, that in this book you see an integration of so many topics, from diplomatic history to oral histories to the Argentine context, I will return to this, to other contexts, to the history of Israel, to the history of Jews, and especially the issue of Jewish experiences and Jewish perspectives. And I say all this because although I work in similar or converging or parallel fields, I generally work on the bad guys, on the people that hated the Jews. And for me, it is like a great source of knowledge to learn what's going on in terms of the people that actually represented the community that I belong to. And yet this is something that is an integration, and it was like even you could see in this book like a very acute explanation of the extreme right groups. And even we have, by the way, incidentally, a great picture of this major anti-Semite and fascist Father Julio Minville. And anyway, so I just wanted to start giving you a kind of general, describing my reaction to this book, which was one of great pleasure in learning, also in a way, but this can be complicated a little bit, great pleasure in knowing more about this ability to react against fascism, particularly given the current times, that we live in. But certainly, and perhaps even more importantly, the idea when I was reading this book, Raanan was helping me understand so many different contexts and histories. And in that sense, it is really a major work because it provides answers to different fields that often actually do not talk to each other. So one of the things that I would like to start, I mean, which is a major thing, and also for selfish reasons, I started with this, or when I was reading it, I was like reflecting on this, which is the issue of how to read and to understand these histories vis-a-vis major myths that were created out of them and even before them, and certainly these myths emanate from the memories, including many of the sources that were interviewed in Raanan's book. Because the book starts, and I will return to Adriana's. I was also quite stricken by the first moment in the book in which you have like these two Argentine Jews that decide to avenge what happened before, and they, and this is, and here I start my own reading of this. I mean, in terms of how I will narrate this, which is of course mirrors the way Raanan is narrating this. So basically, you have these Argentine Jews, not in Buenos Aires, but perhaps in a more rural setting, that decide to avenge an attack by an Argentine fascist by attacking the Argentine fascists. So they decide, and this is central here in the narrative, they decide to ride on horses and attack this guy. And I was thinking, this connects so much to the myth of Argentina in terms of the gaucho, but also to the myth of the Argentine Jewish community in terms of the Argentine gauchos. So you have, and it's so interesting and in a way so symptomatic that when they decide to start their attack, they decide that it's important to know how to ride a horse. So anyway, so that's why I started, I wanted to start with this and a particular gem, which is of course the way Raanan wanted to start the book. That is the starting point of the book, which is so symptomatic of a larger issue. That is that they not only were reacting to fascism in general or globally, which they were, and Raanan rightly explains this, anti-Semitism within waves of anti-Semitism and Jewish self-defense in Argentina, in other places, by the way, but I'm focusing on Argentina in my own comments, which were global but also national. So here, these two combinations, and in a way, they were personifying a myth. Now, what is, of course, fascinating in the book is that Raanan deconstructs, untangles these situations by explaining the meaning of this in terms of, for example, major issues in Argentine political culture, and I would perhaps argue in terms of Israeli political culture and other political cultures as well. So this is one thing that I wanted to start commenting on. Then, of course, there are like issues that I think we should pay attention to, and Raanan actually raises this issue in the book. And sometimes I agree with Raanan that, as an Argentine Jew, why sometimes these issues can be seen as difficult. And by this, I mean the participation of Israel in promoting political activities in Argentina, including Jewish self-defense. Because when Argentine Jews are attacked by an Argentine fascist, this is part of Argentine political events. And here, and Raanan explains why this was not only problematic at the time, but sometimes affected the historiographical views on this. And he rightly criticizes what is, to a large extent, a historiography that is, as he says, institutionally oriented and ideologically biased, sometimes for the right reasons, but at the end of the day, we are historians. Many decades happen, as Raanan explains, after these events, and we need to know what happened. And Raanan not only explains what happened, but rather explains the reasons behind that and the larger context. So returning to something Adriana said, like here, what you would find is a very much of a stress on Jewish agency, which is also really important in this context. And by the agency, I mean the experience and the motivations that led many of these historical actors to fight against the fascists. Now, here again, Raanan complicates the picture because, I mean, as a reader, I mean, personally, I was happy to learn about this in some of, people that can be regarded as my ancestors in many ways. But then Raanan explains that, I mean, the problematic dimensions of this, because like to some extent, these ideas to fight were also related to, let's say, stereotypical images of both the diasporic Jew and the Israeli Jew. And this idea that these fantasies, as Raanan presents them, of Israeli bravery. And I don't mean by this, and certainly he doesn't mean by this, that there was no bravery, but about the fantasy or the mythification of the bravery. So that is, so we have gauchos, but you have also people that would like to think that they are Israeli soldiers. And they were perhaps none, or to some extent they were none of those. And this is something that is really shaping their identity, as Raanan well explains. And I think it's one of the, I wouldn't say contradictions, but certainly complications in this kind of multipolar agencies that we all have, and especially if you are Jewish and you are from Argentina. I would like to mention in passing my admiration about the particular way in which these oral histories were created, and not only the passion, but the deeply ethical stance that Raanan had, because he had to wait a long time to make this history possible. And that's, how oral history is done, I think, in a way that is a model. That is to say that not only you take information from these sources, but you respect them. And you, from there, you explain their agency. So we had to, in a way, wait for this book as readers, in the same way that Raanan had to wait as an author, because he had incredible information and he had to wait because some of the sources asked Raanan that, not to talk about this before they pass. Another interesting, I mean, and to me fascinating dimension, again, like how people are thinking, not only acting in their particular context, but also thinking about, let's say, transhistorical memories. And Raanan pays a special attention to the place of the Holocaust, and how, again, the Holocaust as an experience and a lesson, but to some extent also as a fantasy. Anyway, so I wouldn't say that much about that, because I insist you have to read in the book, but I think that is also a really fascinating aspect. What are they thinking and why are they acting? Sometimes, taking the Holocaust as a lesson, which is, in my view, and I speak here as a citizen, correct. But as an historian would say, perhaps acting out the Holocaust in ways which were not necessarily related to the context they were living in. And this happens not only at the level of, as Raanan explains, at the level of Argentine Jews deciding to fight, but also at the level of government, especially in terms of the Israeli security apparatus and security agencies. Now, one of the issues that also I found fascinating, and I will mention it, and I will move to my last issue, is whether, I mean, Raanan asked the question, and to some extent he answers this question, or he lets the reader to understand and answer this question, which is whether the Argentine model, what he calls this in quotations, the Argentine model of self-defense could be for export, could be replicated in other countries. And I think part of the answer is that he could not, because he was Argentine. And this is something that Raanan has reflected on, especially, I mean, in previous works. I mean, whether we should talk about, which way, where the word Argentina starts when you think about Argentine Jews, or where the notion of Argentina starts. And Raanan, being, an historian of different national contexts and a transnational historian as such, in that way, he pays a lot of respect to, or pays a lot of respect is not the right way of saying this. I would say he really is careful to understand the national histories, and especially the national history of Argentina, in shaping the special political culture of these actors. And thereby he raises a couple of very, I would say, complex and complicating pictures here. Because one of them is, to what extent this desire, and this is a question that Raanan asked, I'm not, it's not the question, I mean, I asked myself the same question in a different way, but this is not what I saw, this is what Raanan asked. And it is a very poignant and, to some extent, difficult question. To what extent, he asked, notions of violence as presented from these actors engaged in Jewish self-defense mirror or correlated? I would like to be very diplomatic, because Raanan also is, that we are not establishing here like a kind of equation, but to what extent there was the issue of violence in Argentina? And to what extent, this related to the fascist organizations themselves? And to some extent, I mean, one could even perceive or not, I mean, and this is a question in the sources that one could ask the sources, where they were aware of this, that we are not like them. But this is an issue that I think a first question that I would like to ask Raanan if he wants to engage with, because of course there are important distinctions, and yet, like, I mean, what you see is a context in which people think that violence is the answer. I mean, are they to blame? Perhaps not, perhaps yes, depending on your take on Argentine political actors. But this was a context in which perhaps legality was out of the question, as certainly this is the way in which the Israeli government engaged with the Eichmann kidnapping, which is, by the way, a really great chapter in the book, insofar as Raanan stresses, like, the Argentine side has been kind of downplayed, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. Like, there are all these approaches to the kidnapping of Eichmann in Argentina, and Argentine history is left aside. And even some Argentine Jewish actors said, like, we contributed, we had an important role in that, and this is not part of the new myths that are created out of this. Anyway, so that is one thing. And the last thing I would like to say, I would like to mention this fascinating issue of, another example of this that Raanan mentions, of course, and raises, which is that, Tacuara, which is a big fascist actor in the book, insofar as this was one of perhaps the main group that the Jewish Argentine citizens engaged in self-defense were fighting. It was a kind of a spear. I mean, it refers to a spear, a 19th century spear, like a weapon that was used by some Argentine warriors or fighters. And against that, one of the names that was used was Facón, to self-describe, right? In addition to Vitajón and other, Argentinized or Latin Americanized categories, they were referred as Facón, which is like another kind of very gaucho / slang word for, for knife. So anyway, like, this was interesting. They are Tacuara, we are Facón, and so on and so forth. And to me, like, I would like to finish with this and with the last question, which is just, my father actually told me that briefly he belonged to this Facón, and he was really scared when they were, like, sometimes many nights, I think in Lanús, like in a community center, like waiting for the fascists to come and defending the institution and so on. And yet, as Raanan shows, this was not the main aspect, like, driving this history. It's the most known aspect, but not necessarily the most important one. Finally, Raanan, I will ask you if you could reflect a little bit, if you want, like on how this gives us, or how this, because we have, there is a lot of knowledge to be in all these fields, but I was wondering how much, I mean, and Argentine historians will learn from reading this book. If you could reflect, I mean, on Argentine historiography on this issue as well, or how you think we could reframe questions in Argentine historiography, because I think it will, but I don't want to give that answer, I mean, in that way. Anyway, thank you so much, Raanan, for writing it, and you for being here.
Okay, so thank you so much, both Adriana and Federico. I very much enjoyed your take on this book. It's always a great fun to see how other people read your work, and both of you have experience with that feeling, if you would like. Yes, I think that both of you touched upon probably the main issues that I wanted to highlight in this book. The issue of belonging and not belonging that Adriana mentioned, the issue of the long trajectory. Self-defense activities started at least back in the 1930s, but they became somewhat different following the establishment of the State of Israel, following the Holocaust, and surely following the kidnapping of Adolf Eichmann in May 1960. And Federico emphasized time and again the local or national aspects of this history. And we see here a huge gap between the way Israel and Israelis looked at events taking place in Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Venezuela, and other countries, and between the way Jewish Argentines or Jewish Uruguayans or Jewish Chileans looked at this. One of the opening quotes of the book is by a former Mossad agent known as Tarzan, quote unquote, and he told me that whenever he met self-defense activists, be it in Argentina or France, in Uruguay or Italy, he always had the same message, as if the local context made no difference at all. I have it here in front of me. I explained them the motto: be distrustful and be efficient at all times. Everything you do must prevent attacks on Jews. And then he said, my starting point is that everyone is anti-Semitic, and it doesn't make any difference to me which region or which country we are talking about. But in fact, as Federico also highlighted, the story had a very unique Argentine character when we talk about Argentina, and it had a very unique Uruguayan character when we talk about the Uruguayan context. And here, let me open parentheses. One of the things that impressed me most when I did the research on Uruguay is that myth that in Uruguay, unlike in Argentina, there were hardly any anti-Semitic organizations, and therefore there was no need to organize self-defense. And this myth of Uruguay being the Switzerland of South America, where Jews could live happily with no concern at all, turned out to be far from reality, quote unquote. And in Uruguay, a large percentage of the community was involved in self-defense activities. But I go back to the mention of gauchos and Jewish gauchos, Tacuara and Facon. Federico referred here to Samuel Tarnopolsky, a novel published in 1969, La mitad de nada. And there he indeed refers to the Jewish self-defense group as Facon, which indeed gives it a very Argentine, almost indigenous character. One of the main challenges that I had to face when writing this book was the inability to do traditional archival work. Most of the relevant documents are in the archives of the Mossad. And the Israeli state keeps changing the law so that to make sure that no researcher, no scholar can access the archives of the Mossad. Originally, after 50 years, they were supposed to open up at least part of the relevant documents. Then they changed the law to 70 years, and then they changed it again to 90 years. None of us will be able to look at the documents there. And furthermore, when one asks for a file of the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there is an internal selection made by the archivists before they let you look at the file. So in most cases, when there were documents written by Israeli diplomats about self-defense activities, they were taken out of the file, given to me or to any other researcher. Here and there, fortunately, we are talking about human beings, they made mistakes. And I was able to find some documents from the embassy in Caracas to the chief security officer in the embassy in Buenos Aires, asking them to send another set of revolvers, the same kind that you sent us earlier before, because the muchachos, quote unquote, would like to use them in their activities, etc. One other way of confronting this challenge was to look at less important archives where archivists do not tend to make a prior selection of the documents before they let you look at the files. So, for example, in the archives of the Beitar movement in Tel Aviv, I happened to find an extremely important and crucial document for this book, written by one of the founders of self-defense, Jewish self-defense in Montevideo in the early 60s, a 48-page document, which included names of people involved, names of institutions which they guarded, even the type of weapons they used, etc., etc. So sometimes you have to look not, under the lights, but on the side as well. But mostly it was an oral history project, and I interviewed more than 120 people. And in my database, there are still very, very many names of people involved that I simply had no time to, at one point, one has to decide that he or she wants to stop and start writing, because we can continue and continue on and on with the interview. Oral history is problematic, but using written texts that we find in archives is problematic as well, or using images, etc. So one has to be careful to put documents in the context, to cross-examine and cross-check documents, etc. In most of the cases, I was interested in interviewing the people not in order to get specific information, because as you said, Adriana, after 40, 50 years, people tend to, either not remember specific dates, places, events, or they know about things after they happened, and they try to relate them as if they knew them at the time, etc. I was mostly interested to understand what motivated them, what was their feeling as they took part in certain activities, whether they felt comfortable or uncomfortable in throwing Molotov cocktail bottles on printing houses which printed anti-Semitic literature, or when they attacked physically one of the nationalist thugs, etc. And since it was that important for me, as you said, I tried to let the reader hear their own voice, not just give a kind of a synthesis that I make out of the testimonies. And it took me very many years to convince at least some of the people to share with me the memories and their testimonies. The first testimonies I gathered when I worked on my book, Argentina, Israel, and the Jews, back in the late 1990s, early 2000. But most of the testimonies were taken during the pandemic years, that is the past 3 years or so. Talking about the long trajectory, we historians always try to look at continuities and changes. So you're right, Adriana, when you point to, I don't know, the Mundo Israelita survey of 1941. But at the same time, it's important to stress that the context of the 1960s was completely different. So there are certainly continuities, but we would say it's a different ballgame in the 1960s. And yes, in Argentina of the 1960s, Federico, as you said, the use of violence in order to promote a political agenda or to fight for a certain political goal was very common. In this sense, Jews and non-Jews alike used violence in order to promote their political agenda. But although they were fighting the same enemy, like the socialists or the communists and others, they were ordered, and I use this verb specifically, they were ordered by the Israeli emissaries to avoid an anti-fascist alliance with local Argentine groups, mostly left-wing groups. I think that Sandra McGee-Deutsch was here with us at one point, maybe she's still here, and she recently organized a session on anti-fascism in Latin America after World War II, and I was asked to participate in this session, in this panel, and I tried to explain why this anti-fascist struggle of Jewish youth was also a specific ethnic struggle, and since they were also trying to promote immigration or aliyah to Israel, they were not willing to work closely or collaborate with socialist, communist, and other left-wing organizations who also fought against fascist or nationalist Argentine thugs. And yes, I'm not sure whether it was Adriana or you, Federico, who mentioned the fact that graduates, quote unquote, of the Irgun of Jewish self-defense were very much sought after by guerrilla groups in the 1970s, Montoneros, or more specifically the ERP, because unlike, UBA students who were maybe well-versed in Marxist thought, but they had no clue about the use of weapons, about operating in a clandestine manner, etc., etc. So there were more than a few that started their activities within the framework of the Irgun or Bitachon or Misgeret or any other Hebrew name they used for the self-defense groups, and then they moved to the Montoneros or the ERP. Federico, you raised the issue of the relevance of this study. And I think that to some extent it is relevant because Jewish communities in different places nowadays also face the challenge of going anti-Semitism. And in the epilogue of the book, I refer to all sorts of semi-military camps in the US operated by former Israeli military officers and trying to teach Jewish Americans how to use arms in case of an anti-Semitic attack. They make a lot of money out of these activities, but the political and moral question is whether indeed this is the way to fight against anti-Semitic violence. Is violence the only answer to violence, or maybe it makes more sense to try and create a kind of an anti-fascist, anti-nationalist alliance or front and work together with other groups and organizations. But it's also relevant because Israel continues I get a message from Federico that there's a technical problem. I hope you can follow me at this point, because Israeli leaders keep thinking in the same way nowadays as they used to think back in the 1960s. And I quote in the epilogue from a couple of speeches, one by Menachem Begin in 1982, another one by Benjamin Netanyahu in later years, in response to anti-Semitic attacks in France. They were kind of threatening the French authorities that if they don't take responsibility and deal with anti-Semitic thugs in their own country, Israel will come and make sure that these anti-Semitic organizations stop attacking Jews. This is extremely problematic, and indeed, in the version of the speech made by Menachem Begin, the original one included a specific threat to send Israelis to fight anti-Semitism in France, and then somebody explained to Menachem Begin that it might be somewhat problematic, so he crossed out this sentence from his speech. A couple of other comments, and then I will let you open the floor to comments and questions in Spanish or English. I do keep also, I keep getting all sorts of comments that this book should not have been published because it might harm the interest or security of Jewish communities in the Southern Cone, or damage Israeli relations with South America. Look, it's true that I decided not to include the case of Venezuela in this book because in the specific political context of contemporary Venezuela, there might be people who would try to use it against Jews. But otherwise, the historians, it's something that I cannot accept. We had recently a book launch of my former student, Gustavo Guzman, who was also here, maybe he's still here, about the Jewish community in Chile and its ties or relations with the Pinochet government. And some people told him maybe at this moment to publish something about the good relations between the organized Jewish community of Chile and Pinochet might harm the interests of the community there. This might be said about very many topics, and us historians, we have our job, we have to do it with the, in a responsible way, but it's not something that we could avoid. Maybe I would stop here and let people comment or make questions.
Thank you very much, Raanan, Adriana, of course, and Federico. So yes, we are opening for questions. Feel free to ask in English or Spanish. If you want, you can just open your microphone and ask the question or write it on the chat. I will start then. I would like to know a little bit more deep into methodology. Besides the archives in Israel, did you visit other archives in Argentina, Uruguay, or any other country?
Yeah, I have to unmute myself if I want you to hear me. I certainly worked in several archives in the US, and in fact, the first written documents on Jewish self-defense in Argentina and Uruguay, I found in the archives of the American Jewish Committee in New York, but also some references at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. In Argentina, I looked at several, I wouldn't say archives, but I did get some material from the IVO in Buenos Aires, and through colleagues in the province of Buenos Aires, several documents from police documents of the province of Buenos Aires, and more specifically about this incident in which a police officer was killed by a group of Jewish self-defense. It was a big, a huge issue, but Israel and the leaders of the Jewish community managed to solve it in a subtle way. But nowadays, I guess that killing a police officer in the province of Buenos Aires would have made a huge scandal, undoubtedly. In the case of Uruguay, I mostly used hemerotecas, that is, went over Uruguayan newspapers, and a Uruguayan colleague helped me get several documents from the police there in Uruguay, especially having to do with the assassination of Nazi war criminal Herbert Zuckus in Montevideo in 1965. But mostly, I did interviews, and I conducted the interviews in Israel, in Argentina, in Uruguay, and in the US. And okay, that's my answer to your question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other question?
I have a comment, if possible.
Yes.
I myself are a sample of somebody who was in her 20s in the 1960s in Argentina. So I lived through all that period. Even Graciela Sirota, who was the famous victim of Tacuara, and we studied at the same school in the same years. And what I would like to add is something about the atmosphere among Jewish and mainly Zionist youth in those years. I myself, for a very short time, was also in one of the defense groups, but not enough to be able to tell much about it. But I was mainly involved in what was in all Latin America, the Zionist University Student Association, of which the main center was the Centro Universitario Sionista in Buenos Aires. And we were connected. We knew many of our members were also in the defense groups, but we also tried other ways of bringing knowledge, information about Jews, about anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust to the non-Jewish community, university community of the time. I just want to remind you that in those days we were only scarcely 20 years away from the Holocaust. So the Holocaust was a very active presence. And we tried, I remember we printed a kind of paper, short handmade magazine, which we brought to universities in order so that the whole community could know about what was happening, reacting to also to, of course, the Tacuara and other attacks. And I remember especially, I want to mention it, that in April 1963, we organized a huge event commemorating the 20th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And it was done at the Facultad de Ciencias Económicas, which was one of the most anti-Semitic centers at the University of Buenos Aires. The event was attended by almost 1,000 people, and it was a great success. And as also in relation to what you said about the scope, Jewish, Argentinian, more than that, in that act we had speakers like, for instance, Luis Jimenez de Azúa, who was the president of Spanish Republic in exile. So, is other, we also had Heike Grossman representing Israel, and very central figures of the Argentine politic and academic scene. So what I remember that the defense groups were one very specific, special way of a very broad effort in order to assert ourselves as proud Jews in Argentina, and of making that known to all Argentina, or in our case, to all academic community in Argentina. Just wanted to add this to the picture that has been described.
Thank you so much, Florinda. This is certainly very relevant. And I think that I do refer to this meeting at the Facultad de Ciencias Económicas. I think that Alfredo Palacios was there as well.
Alfredo Palacios was there too. Yeah. I have pictures if you want.
I want, yes, definitely.
Okay,
And
I have
Bernardo Plixberg was also one of the...
of course.
In this event. Yes, the Holocaust, the Shoah was very present
absolutely
in the minds of all members of the Irgun, of the self-defense groups, and most of the emissaries were either Holocaust survivors. The emissaries from Israel were either Holocaust survivors or former partisans who fought against the Nazis in the forests of Europe, or even some who had participated in all sorts of revenge activities against Nazis or against Germans in general at the end of World War II.
Anokmim.
Anokmim, that's right. The visits to Argentina of Abba Kovner, Heike Grossman, Cynthia Lubetkin, and others had an enormous impact on Jewish youth in Argentina and Uruguay. By the way, Ashkenazi and Sephardi alike.
Of course.
So it was of an extreme importance. Yes, I agree with you. There is a question here by Gustavo Guzman, how these Jewish Argentinian self-defense group contrasted with the virtual inexistence of Jews in Argentina's armed forces. Well, indeed, unlike in the case of Chile that you are researching, Gustavo, there were hardly any Jewish officers in the Argentine armed forces at the time, but very many Jewish Argentines, like many Argentines in general, had to do some military service. So some of them did get some experience in the armed forces, and I also refer to a couple of cases where they let other Jewish youngsters to enter a military base and train during the weekends. So in a way, the fact that there were no officers, military officers in Argentina's armed forces wasn't a factor in shaping the type of activities that they conducted in Argentina. And I'm not sure whether the fact that in Chile there were, from the late 19th century onward, as you taught me, there were Jewish officers in the armed forces. Whether it affected in any way the organization in Chile, which had its base in Bomba, Israel, in the firefighters' base of Jewish Chileans, a topic that I will refer to in the forthcoming LAJSA conference at Brandeis in early July.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? Adriana?
Do we have a minute? I'm actually going to ask Raanan, I'm going to put him on the spot, so that he perhaps addresses the question that Federico asked, which I would be very interested in hearing, one of them, which is, how do you see this entering, and if, right, Argentine historiography? And so what are your thoughts, right, on what does your particular work and covering, right, these topics, what do they add, right, to Argentine history, Argentine historiography? So I'm sorry, Federico, but I just wanted to hear his answer to this your wonderful question.
I think that this study makes it clear how expanded was this notion in 1960s Argentina of the use of violence as part of the political struggle. I mean, that it wasn't limited to specific right-wing organizations and specific guerrilla movements on the left, but it was by far more extended and included various sectors that normally we do not tend to believe that they were involved in violent actions. But in fact, they were. And they were because of various reasons. Some of them are very Argentine reasons. We know of all sorts of negotiations between leaders of Jewish self-defense groups and leaders of Tacuara. They had ceasefire periods here and there. They were playing on the same field, to use a sports metaphor. And to continue along this line, sometimes there was some mutual respect between the various Jewish and extreme right-wing nationalist groups, as if we were talking about two football clubs fighting each other. So there were sometimes unwritten rules of what you could or could not do, or at what level of violence could you react to a certain violent action by your enemy, etc. So yes, you mentioned, Federico, this concept of a mirror image. So to some respect, the Irgun was a mirror image of Tacuara. If you look at the same age group, if you look at the same feeling of urgency, that if you do not act now in a very clear and aggressive way, you might miss the opportunity to change society or change reality. That's the only way to avoid a catastrophe or a second Holocaust in Argentina. You have, if you are a member of the nationalist right-wing groups, you have a narrow window of opportunity to get rid of this corrupt liberal democracy. So you have to act now and use force in order to promote your political ends. So I think that in this sense, for both the cases of Argentina, but also Uruguay, again, which we tend to look at as a very pacific, quote unquote, society, unlike the violent Argentine society. Well, in both cases, the willingness to use violence for political ends was much more extended than we have tended to believe so far.
Debbie Shamnak added to the question also, what about Uruguayan historiography?
Well, in the case of Uruguay, there was hardly any mention of Jewish self-defense until this book. There was one book published a few years ago by a political scientist. Somehow, for a second, his name escapes me. But it referred mostly to the 1980s, 1990s onward, where you still have, obviously, self-defense organizations and activities, but they are of a completely different kind compared to the 1960s and the early 1970s. I was surprised during several interviews that I made that people started talking about Uruguay as a model democracy with hardly any fascist or neo-Nazi activities. But then later on, they started talking about clashes with extreme right-wing nationalist organizations. Yes, the Uruguayan case is very interesting. I find it hard to understand how come relatively few people are aware of the assassination of Herbert Tsoukours by Mossad agents in Montevideo in 1965. I mean, most Israelis with whom I spoke said, Herbert Tsoukours, I mean, it didn't even ring a bell to them. And this was the only case when the Mossad assassinated a Nazi war criminal. And yes, Jewish Uruguayans were also involved, although historiography hasn't paid any attention to this, as in the case of Argentina. It's only the glorious Mossad which is able to conduct such activities.
If we don't have another question, I would like to close with one.
I have
Yes.
not a question, but a small anecdote. A person I know, and I won't say, of course, the name, who was very much involved in the defense groups, and then made Aliyah and worked in public service. When it came retirement time, had some documents proving the activity in the defense groups, and these years were added to his VETEC, to the curriculum, with views of her retirement pension, which I think is interesting that so many years after that, Israeli still knew about that and took that into account. Just wanted to tell this small story.
Very interesting. I was not aware of this.
Okay. We can talk if you want about
Definitely.
that. Okay.
Okay, so a last question. If we try to look globally about the activity of Irgun, how would you define the effectivity of the Irgun, of the participation of local Jews in defending or guarding the Jewish community?
I think, well, first of all, you had, to one extent or another, Jewish self-defense organizations practically in all countries. The US has been an exception. Israeli authorities made a decision years ago to avoid any such involvement in the United States. The Pollard case was the only case in which it was proved that Israel was directly involved in US internal affairs, if you would like, but this was the exception. You've had Jewish self-defense groups in the US, but they were local initiatives not supported by Israel in any way. Of course, you had Meir Kahana's Jewish Defense League, especially in New York, more or less at the same time that we discuss here. But Israel was not that cautious, let's say, when it came to South America, and especially Argentina. Argentina was a theater of operations for the Mossad all along the 1960s, and we know several agents spending some time in Argentina before they went to Arab countries and operate there. We know of, and I think I mentioned it in the book, of an Arab pilot who defected to Israel with his airplane, and then Israel made sure that he would go hiding in Argentina. And although there was a diplomatic crisis between Argentina and Israel, a short one, but a diplomatic crisis between the two countries following the kidnapping of Adolf Eichmann, still the Mossad used Argentina for very many purposes all along the 1960s, which is somewhat surprising to me, and makes me think that maybe the Argentine authorities were aware at least of some of these operations and simply closed their eyes for one reason or another. But you had such groups and such organizations in each and every country. I think that you have to look at these groups within the context of the diasporic relations or the diasporic dynamic between Israel and Jewish communities in the Americas. And as Federico said, in order to study this, you have to be able to offer both the Israeli context, the Jewish context, and the local Latin American context, be it in one country or another.
Okay, thank you. So I think we are going to close. Thank you so much, Raanan Rein, Adriana Brodsky, and Federico Finchelstein. It was really interesting. I really recommend to read the whole book. It has lots of information and very revealing ones. We will meet again, so on March 6th, presenting Ariana Uberman's book. I wish you a very nice evening or noon, wherever you are. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Gracias.
Thank
Ciao.
you.